From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And ahead today, K-State's Megan Niederwerder will talk about her latest work on the transmission of African swine fever. Her research has identified how long the ASF virus can remain viable when transported via swine feed ingredients that hopefully will lead to answers on controlling this disease and preventing it from spreading to the U.S. Then K-State's Glynn Tonsor will talk about his new economic analysis of how beef and pork demand have changed in the aftermath of mandatory country of origin labeling being rescinded 3 years ago. And later this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Gregg Eyestone on harvesting and storing those last garden tomatoes and peppers for the season. Here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Agriculture Today. It repeatedly is in the agricultural news, regrettably, and that is the spread of this devastating disease to swine herds in many parts of the world, thankfully not in the U.S. yet, and hopefully we'll keep it that way. Talking about African swine fever. Researchers here at Kansas State University have been doing their due diligence, and then some of late, studying this disease and what actually, in the case we'll talk about today, moves it about. And there's been some discoveries here. There have been some discoveries that could be very valuable in addressing this disease. Joining us now from the College of Veterinary Medicine at K-State, an assistant professor of diagnostic medicine and pathobiology, Megan Niederwerder. Megan has just completed another round of research on African swine fever as it relates to livestock feed. Megan, before we go any further, this disease is serious. It's actually frightening to the U.S. swine industry, and you and others at K-State are trying to come up with answers to counteract it, aren't you?
Yes, absolutely. So African swine fever virus is currently circulating in China and several other Asian countries. And over the last year, this virus has expanded its territory to impact countries that it's never impacted historically. And so it's an emerging threat. And because there is no vaccine and no treatment, the focus of our research has really been to understand the risk and then ways that we can put in mitigation strategies to reduce the risk.
And that is channeled through the role that feed plays in its spread then, correct?
Yes. So since 2013, when PEDV was introduced, porcine epidemic diarrhea virus, we started to understand the potential role that feed may play in the introduction and transmission of transboundary diseases to swine herds. And part of that is that millions of kilograms of feed ingredients are imported from countries that have circulating foreign animal diseases that we currently do not have in the U.S. And those feed ingredients then come from those countries that have diseases, and then they're brought to our feed mills, incorporated into diets that are then fed to our pigs. And so since the introduction of PEDV and the recognition of feed as a potential risk, our goal has been to understand what's the risk of feed for other foreign animal diseases. And the biggest one at this time point for pigs, really, and animal health globally is African swine fever.
And your previous work confirmed that African swine fever can be effectively transmitted through feed.
Yes. So historically, African swine fever virus has been known to be transmitted through direct contact, so snout-to-snout contact between pigs, commercial pigs, and then also contact with feral pigs, through consumption of contaminated pork products as well. but it really hadn't been investigated if the transmission was capable through plant-based feed ingredients. And that was what we wanted to investigate, is do plant-based feed ingredients actually support the virus to be transmitted when it's naturally consumed by pigs? And we did confirm that it's capable of being transmitted. And one of the interesting things about our research is that it showed that as a pig consumed a contaminated batch of feed, let's say over time, the risk of infection and the probability went up.
But you've taken this a step further now to look at a connected aspect to that, and that is the durability of the African swine fever virus as it travels along with the feed?
Yes. So we used a transoceanic model that we actually utilize an environmental chamber that allows us to fluctuate the temperature and humidity values every 6 hours. And what we did was look at historical data that showed what the environmental conditions that would simulate this transoceanic shipment of feed ingredients. And the time period was 30 days. And we took that time period and those temperature and humidity values that, again, simulated the transoceanic conditions, subjected feed ingredients that had been contaminated with ASF, and looked at how the virus degraded over the 30 days. We took samples at various time points during the 30 days and then quantified the level of infectious virus. And we used that to then calculate half-life estimates to understand the length of time that it would take for the virus to decay by approximately half.
So when you looked at this via this model, did you find that the virus has a long shelf life within that 30-day time frame?
So the average half-life in all the feed ingredients we tested was 12.2 days, but there was some variation. So it was between 9.6 and 14.2 days. So there was this variability dependent on feed ingredient and the ability for that feed ingredient to support the virus and the stability. One of the most interesting things about the study that we found was that all of the half-lives in feed and feed ingredients were longer than the half-life that we calculated in media, which is what's used in tissue culture and in the lab to support the virus. And so what we ultimately found was that these feed and feed ingredients have the composition, the protein content, the moisture content that increases stability of the virus when compared to that media.
Like you say, the conditions of the feed itself as it is in transit will vary widely, so you have a number of variables moving here that make this hard to pin down.
Yes. And one of the biggest things about this study was that we wanted to replicate our initial discovery about the ability for the virus to survive the 30-day period. That initial study just looked to see if the virus was actually, if we could pick up infectious virus at the conclusion of the study. And so we replicated the whole study again to, again, confirm those initial findings that, yes, the virus can survive for the 30 days, but then also use these additional time points to characterize how the virus decays over time in the feed ingredients.
As you went about this research, Megan, did you find that varying feed ingredients will support African swine fever virus differently? Is it viable equally across all feedstuffs?
No, one of the interesting findings was the variation between the half-life of ASF in different feed ingredients. And one of the findings in this latest work that was perhaps most surprising is that there was a difference in the half-life between even conventional soybean meal and organic soybean meal. So even the differences within ingredient, likely based on how they're processed, can change the viability or stability of the virus within that feed ingredient.
That's something you want to learn more about.
Yes.
That's what drives that variability.
Exactly. We hypothesize that it has to do with protein content, moisture content, and also fat content. But truly defining what the composition of a feed ingredient or any ingredient that promotes virus stability the most is something we are still learning about.
So you have this information in hand. How can it be used as a defense, if you will, against African swine fever being vectored by feed ingredients?
Sure. Well, half-life is a fairly standard way to understand the inactivation rate of a virus. And so when we think about half-life, between 5 and 7 half-lives will allow you to degrade the virus between 97 to 99%. And so you can take this half-life, which is independent of the initial concentration, and look at that to see how long it would take the virus to decay to a certain level or percentage. And then we can look at storage time recommendations, understanding if there are recommendations or policies that we can put in place to reduce the risk of ASF being transmitted through feed ingredients. It's very difficult to eliminate risk, but this is something that we can put in place to reduce the risk of transmission or introduction of the virus to our farms.
So potentially, method of storing feedstuffs could be modified or altered to suppress, if you will, African swine fever. That's the theory anyway.
Yes, I think there's multiple components of looking at feed as a potential risk factor for ASF. The other mitigation strategies that we're currently researching is looking at, is there a temperature that we can utilize to increase the speed at which the virus decays in feed ingredients? And also there are several antiviral chemical mitigants that we're looking at for potential feed additives to, again, reduce the risk of the virus being transmitted.
So that's really the next step in your continuing work on
this. Yes.
So it's encouraging that we're making headway because it's evident the damage that this disease can cause, devastatingly so, to hog herds, and we've witnessed that in Asia already, hopefully keeping it out of the U.S. through these protocols that you're talking about. So do keep up the good work, Megan. We appreciate you letting us know about it right here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. She is over from the College of Veterinary Medicine at K-State, the Department of Diagnostic Medicine and Pathobiology, Megan Niederwerder. She's been working on African swine fever and its tendencies as it might be transmitted through feed ingredients, and coming up with some important information that may help the industry fend this disease off, prevent it from becoming a devastating condition in the U.S. hog herd. This is Agriculture Today. We'll be back shortly on the K-State Radio Network.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
Welcome back. You're listening to Agriculture Today. There is more chatter now in livestock production circles about the possible resurgence, if you will, of a policy which was in place not all that long ago. It's been put on the shelf for a while. But there is talk about bringing back what's called mandatory country of origin labeling of meat products. An individual who has watched the rise and fall, if you will, of MCOOL for short, is with us now from the Agricultural Economics Department at K-State. He's frequently here on the broadcast. K-State Research and Extension livestock economist Glynn Tonsor, who's just recently put together an analysis of MCOOL and its impact on beef and pork demand. But just to set the table here, Glynn, is MCOOL rising from the ashes here? There seems to be some talk in that direction.
Well, there certainly is ongoing interest in certain parts of primarily the cattle industry, but we'll be more general here, the meat and livestock industry, thinking that we should bring back mandatory country of origin labeling. For our listeners, I will remind them that was a law that was in place 2009 through 2015 and was repealed. I have done lots of economic analyses on that. We'll get all to that in a moment. But the punchline of the law was it was mandatory that if you bought a product, particularly beef and pork, we're going to refer to here today, at a grocery store, it had to indicate the country that it came from. So it could say product of U.S., for example, or it would make a distinction if that animal had been in Canada at some point or Mexico at some point. So that type of information showed up on the label. Exactly how the label was positioned changed during the duration of the law. There was a debate about how to do that and so forth. But to kind of keep it at the 30,000-foot level, the stated intent was consumers' desire to know the country of origin for those products and where the animal resided before it became a meat product. And that became law. And with that comes cost of compliance, which goes into a benefit cost assessment. And also with that comes attempts to quantify the benefit. So what was the demand impact of that law? And then ultimately, was there a positive benefit cost ratio is what we look for in those policy assessments. Punchline of what, not just the work I did, but other analyses on it, was very unlikely that it was a positive benefit cost, primarily because we know there were costs. There's debates and different estimates on the cost, but they're not zero. It costs money to track and segregate live animals and meat products and to put labels on and so forth. So it is not free. The proverbial no free lunch in economics applies here full-heartedly. And there's, in my assessment, no estimate that is showing a demand benefit. So in other words, there's no evidence of a positive demand development following implementation of the law. So if you don't have evidence of a benefit and you have evidence of a cost, that's not a desirable benefit-cost ratio, and that led to, along with some retaliatory WTO discussions and so forth, combined into taking the law off the books here in the U.S.
And you just more or less summarized that 2015 work that you and colleagues here at Kansas State University previously did on mandatory country of origin labeling and its influence. But because it has been taken off the books, you wanted to go back and create a new analysis looking at those periods of time before, during, and after MCOOL and get a tighter handle on that demand impact?
In short, yes. Part of it is recognition of renewed interest in the countryside and the topic. So I get this question, and I'm trying to contribute knowledge in that space. But the other part is, and this is going to sound a little more geeky researcher for a moment, but my past efforts occurred either before the law was in place or during, and there really wasn't an opportunity after the repeal to assess it during the timing of my last projects. So again, the law came off the books in December, is no longer implemented after December of 2015. So we now have a decent period of post-MCOOL, think January 16 through, specifically for a moment here in July of 2019, we have observed beef and pork demand for the post period as well as during and before that allows us to use a different approach to answer the question, was demand better when we had MCOOL in place? And that leads us to the fact sheet that I recently posted to our website.
And you did this for both beef and pork separately, correct?
I did. And for context here, some of our listeners may be aware of this, is every month I post a domestic meat demand index to measure the strength of either beef or pork domestic demand. And I do that for lots of reasons because I talk about demand strength in my main job. But that also becomes a useful tool, an instrument to answer the question, was demand per that measure different during MCOOL now that we are operating at a period after the repeal? So we observe demand pre, during, and after, and that's what I try to summarize in this fact sheet.
It's important to point out that there are factors other than mandatory country of origin labeling that will influence demand trends. So you attempted to account for those.
Very much so. And real simply is, the population mix changes over time. The relative role of today's millennials in buying in 2019 is quite different than it would have been in 2010, right? That particular person may not have been the household decision maker back in 2010. Now they are. It's pretty well documented. A lot of households have a favorable high protein kind of view that's supportive of both beef and pork demand today. That probably wasn't the case during MCOOL. So you're exactly right, Eric. There's a host of things that are changing beyond the MCOOL policy. There are some of them good, some of them detrimental to meat demand. And yes, we need to be cognizant of that. This simply just tries to answer the question, controlling for main things, which is seasonality. We know there's seasonal patterns in meat, as well as competing beef prices and pork prices when you're answering the question for spillover effects. So beef demand tends to be impacted by pork and chicken prices and pork demand impacted by beef and chicken prices. So controlling for that and controlling for the general macroeconomic environment, so per capita incomes of consumers. Control for those factors that we know from past literature are important, and then answer the question, was demand stronger during the MCOOL period? And the answer is no, it was not. So the estimates in this fact sheet are actually even controlling for those factors is beef demand as well as pork demand were lower during the period that MCOOL was in place. So MCOOL in itself did not increase demand. And by the way, that is very consistent with how I kind of set the stage in our discussion of what past research has found.
Mm-hmm. If, in fact, mandatory country of origin labeling did not increase demand, did the removal or repeal of the policy show a spike in demand for either commodity?
So there's no reason to believe it would. And when you read this fact sheet, you will see one of the estimates, it looks that way. But that's part of why I was trying to, and your question was good earlier, is there's a lot of things that change. Beef demand and pork demand can be better after MCOOL and have nothing to do with MCOOL being repealed. So, for example, if the population mix has changed, or if just the view on a high-protein diet is present today and it wasn't during that period and so forth, that will be the reason you see a change in demand. There is a reason to believe that repealing the law reduced cost in the industry because you no longer had to comply, and that would allow the industry to reposition and invest those resources somewhere else and maybe ultimately actually help demand in that context. But I'm not sitting here saying I think the repeal improved demand in itself. The clear point is when we had MCOOL in place, we do not have evidence the demand was stronger.
So as folks look at the data, as you put it forth on the agmanager.info website, they may see that there was an improvement in demand post-MCOOL, but it shouldn't be interpreted improperly here.
That is correct. And I try to briefly say that in the fact sheet, but more generally, there's a lot of resources that just say the last 2 or 3 years have been very good on the domestic meat demand front. And I'm not going to attribute that to the absence of MCOOL. I think it's other factors at play. Consumer incomes have been rising, favorability of protein in the diet. There's a whole host of things there that are good for the industry that we need to talk about, and I do talk about those a lot, but they should not be confounded with the removal of MCOOL. That's not the point of this.
So as the concept may be resurrected through discussions anyway about mandatory country of origin labeling and whether it should be reinstated, how do you hope what you've found here will be incorporated into that dialogue?
Well, first and foremost, I hope all policy decisions and industry leader decisions in that space make their decisions based upon information and research-based knowledge and less on emotion. And I hope this and other resources are part of that knowledge set that guides that. The other would be to answer the question, okay, how could this happen? So there is skepticism on how could it not help demand. And I'll give a simple example there is we have a lot of meat products that we produce. In the beef and pork space, you have everything from high-value, desired steak products, right, ribeyes, T-bones, so forth. And then you have lower-value products as well. If these beef and pork products went through the grocery store, they had to be labeled. So there was a cost of compliance, and that information showed up on a beef roast and a pork sausage package at the same time that it did on a pork chop and a T-bone. And it's quite possible that some products are bought by some consumers who value the origin information, but in total, across all people and all products, it's not a net positive. That is very possible. The other piece is there's a big difference between mandatory provision of origin information and voluntary. There's nothing keeping the industry from having private efforts. And, pre-MCOOL, there was a lot of that. During MCOOL, there was some of it. And post-MCOOL, there's some of it where you can document and kind of tell the story of how the meat was produced. There's nothing stopping that. And I highlight that because there probably are sometimes we use the term niche market, but just call them private market opportunities to convey that information to this segment of consumers who are buying the segment of meat products where it's valued. There's nothing in the voluntary space that keeps us from doing that if it is a net benefit of doing it. Mandatory says we had to track all the products, label them all, and incur all the cost of it, and we have some kind of aggregate demand benefit across all those products, which I think it makes it a lot harder to have a positive benefit cost outcome when that's the case.
Very well. It's a good read to producers as you might be monitoring the discussion over the possible return of mandatory country of origin labeling. Again, posted on the agmanager.info website, an overview of MCOOL's impact on domestic beef and pork demand. Good work, as always. Glynn, thanks for summarizing it for us.
Thanks for having me on it.
Livestock economist Glynn Tonsor, K-State Research and Extension. And Agriculture Today will be back after these moments away on the K-State Radio Network.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
This is Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network, now in our 95th year of broadcast service to Kansas agriculture. Eric Atkinson with you, and continuing on now with today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. A group of cattle producers rallied yesterday at a day-long event in Omaha, calling on President Trump to bring more fairness to cattle markets and to reduce the influence of imported beef and cattle on U.S. market prices. This rally was sponsored by RCEF USA and the Organization for Competitive Markets. Some of the key demands at that rally included that the U.S. withdraw from the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement until country of origin labeling is included in the trade deal. Most of the speakers in some way or another pointed to the price collapse the week of August the 12th after the fire the weekend earlier at the Tyson Foods plant in Holcomb. That plant, which is closed until likely January, did account for about 6,000 processed cattle per day, about 5% of the market. Live cattle prices dropped about $8 per hundredweight in the days following the fire, while boxed beef prices rose. USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue announced in late August that the Packers and Stockyards Division would conduct an investigation into the price spread between live cattle and boxed beef following the Tyson fire. Despite Perdue's action, the rally included signs calling on President Trump to fire the USDA secretary, pointing to Perdue's comments on Tuesday in Wisconsin, suggesting that farmers get bigger to survive. Farmer payouts from the Syngenta corn settlement remain on track for some time in 2020, but exactly when remains unknown. The U.S. District Court for the District of Kansas in Kansas City approved the $1.5 billion settlement from that lawsuit filed following Syngenta's release of Agrisure Viptera and Agrisure Duracade corn traits. Syngenta spokesperson Paul Meinhardt previously told DTN that Syngenta plays no role in the distribution of settlement funds, as the company has already contributed the $1.5 billion. A number of parties have filed appeals contesting the settlement, according to court records. To this point, briefs have been filed with the court ahead of oral arguments. There can be no payouts until the appeals are resolved. According to the settlement, there are 4 subclasses approved as eligible for the payments. The first would be farmers who owned any interest in corn in the U.S. but did not plant the Syngenta seeds in question. A second subclass includes any producer who owned any interest in corn in the U.S. priced for sale. Also, producers purchased Viptera and Duracade corn seed, those who did, and producers who produced corn grown from those traits. The settlement also will include any grain handling facility and ethanol plants that owned interest in corn priced for sale during the period. Plaintiffs in the cases alleged that Syngenta sold corn with Viptera and Duracade traits prior to those traits receiving import approvals from several countries, including China. China claims it found and rejected corn shipments containing the traits, which plaintiffs have said led to lower corn prices. Well, there's a special informational event taking place in East Central Kansas next Tuesday that we want to remind you about. Coffee County Extension and the Frontier Extension District are hosting this meeting on beef production and the working cow dog. It'll be this coming Tuesday, the 8th, starting at 10 o'clock in the morning at the Williamsburg Community Building in Williamsburg. The morning presentations will feature Debbie Lyons Blythe of Blythe Angus Ranch and Patty Dollarhide of the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State. They'll be talking about the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. Then late morning into early afternoon, Laura Stemazzi of Stemazzi Working Cow Dogs out of Maxville will highlight the possibilities and abilities of a working stock dog. After lunch, all will travel to the Silkville Ranch, where Laura will continue to discuss the topics and will demonstrate dogs with various levels of training that'll occur throughout the afternoon. Again, that's taking place this Tuesday. Please RSVP by today by going online or calling the Coffee County Extension Office or Frontier District Office. No charge to this event for those attending, but they do need numbers for a meal count and for handouts. Again, beef production and the working cow dog, Tuesday, October the 3rd, starting at the Williamsburg Center Community Building, that is, in Williamsburg. On now to this week's Kansas soybean update. Here's Gregg Eyestone.
Peter Opelt, economist with the Kansas Department of Agriculture, joins us. And Peter, the Grain Commission elections will soon be upon us. So what is KDA's role in the Grain Commission elections?
Yeah, that's right. So KDA oversees all phases of the elections process for the commodity commissions, all for wheat, grain sorghum, soybeans, and sunflowers and corn. And so we oversee and administer the elections process for all of the commissions as directed per the legislative statute that establishes the commissions.
For the districts this year, which of those districts will be up for this election cycle?
This year will be districts 4, 5, and 6, which are the central 3 districts, with Phillips County in the northwest, Comanche County in the southwest, Washington in the northeast, and Sumner in the southeast. So those are the 4 that kind of perimeter the region that'll be in those elections.
So if producers are interested in becoming a candidate, say, for one of those Kansas Soybean Commission elections, can they still do that?
Yes, the deadline for filing is November 30th. Any candidate will have to collect 20 signatures from eligible growers with no more than 5 signatures from one single county.
And Peter, who is eligible to vote in these commission elections?
Sure. An eligible voter is any legal resident of Kansas who is been actively engaged in growing corn, grain sorghum, soybeans, wheat, or sunflowers in the last 3 years, is of legal voting age, and resides in the district for which they wish to vote.
So what are the best places to find all this information?
For more information, you can contact the Kansas corn, grain sorghum, soybean, sunflower, or wheat commissions. And we also have all of the information on the Kansas Department of Agriculture website that includes the brochure, petition forms, and a checklist for everything that a potential candidate will need. And that website is agriculture.ks.gov/KDA-services/Kansas-commodity-commissions.
All right, Peter, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining us.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
That is Peter Opelt, who is an economist with the Kansas Department of Agriculture, on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Thanks, Greg. Gregg Eyestone there. Coming your way next, this week's horticulture segment. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today, 800-321-3276, or visit us online, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions. This Agriculture Today concludes with our weekly segment set aside to talk horticultural matters. In this case, we'll head back out to the vegetable garden and put the capper on a couple of primary crops that we see in our Kansas gardens. Joining us once more, Riley County Extension Horticultural Agent Gregg Eyestone to share some thoughts on bringing in those final tomatoes and peppers of the growing season. And in each case, Greg, it's been a fairly prolific year for those vegetables, has it not?
It has. I think each year's kind of unique, and this year's been very well for my production anyway, as far as the tomato crop. Probably overproduction in my opinion, but I guess that's a challenge that I have to deal with.
It's a tough problem to have.
Sometimes.
And let's talk specifically about tomatoes and how much more productivity we can expect in that they are a warm-loving crop.
That's right. As soon as we get into the cool season, assuming that's coming here, they're basically going to stop growing. And so you're bound to just get what you got. And if there's some partially green tomatoes out there, you may want to consider bringing those in for storage here in the fall and let them ripen indoors.
And the fact is, even though they may not be as sized up as you would like, they do have that finite growth point, and they're getting very close to that.
Yes. The leaf tissue is going to determine how large they get, and so with the leaves starting to shut down, you're probably not going to get any large tomatoes at this point. But once they turn kind of an off green to a little bit of a white stage, you can look at the blossom end of your tomato or the bottom of your tomato. Typically, if it has kind of a star shape to it, that being white from a background of green, then that's probably at the mature stage. It means that the locular jelly, the innards of the tomato, when you cut one open and it falls apart on you, is reached a stage that it will go ahead and turn color and ripen up.
So go ahead and pick them if they're at or past that stage, and then bring them indoors, and they will ripen with some pace here anyway, will
yes.
it not?
Yeah, so basically temperature will regulate how quickly they ripen, which is also a formation of the ethylene gas that all of our fruits give off for their ripening stage. Oftentimes people wrap them in a newspaper or something like that. What you're doing is trapping that ethylene gas around the fruit that hastens the ripening of those. So if you want to probably stagger your tomato ripening, so some of those you may leave on the kitchen counter. Some you may want to put in a little bit cooler location. Never probably want to go below 55 degrees. That would probably damage the tissue itself. But you can put them at different temperatures, and then the amount of ethylene gas, whether you wrap them in something or just leave them open to the atmosphere.
Very good. So a very simple procedure by and large. Once they've ripened, though, they only have so much shelf life. So they need to be used in some fashion fairly readily after that.
Yeah, if you get to a stage where you have a whole bunch of them ripening, depending on your crop there, you may want to go ahead and process those just like you would your average crop during the summertime. Obviously, freezing them is a good way of storing those and using them later in the season.
That's on tomatoes. Again, peppers have produced quite nicely this year as well. How long before they shut down?
So they really like warm temperatures. So once we get really cool, they're basically done growing. And you can just harvest those before we get the frost. That would really damage our tissues. Interesting thing about peppers is they kind of already come ripe, if you would. They do continue to ripen, but you can harvest those at any stage and get the same flavors and textures, basically, that you would from a more mature fruit crop. So it doesn't matter.
And as far as their stayability, they will hang in there in storage a little longer than tomatoes.
Yeah, typically tomatoes we don't want to put in the refrigerator, so that changes their flavors and things. But pepper doesn't matter, so you can store those in a cooler location, particularly your refrigerator, for quite a long time, 3 or 4 weeks probably. But if you have an abundance again, that may be something you want to go ahead and process. These can freeze fairly nice, so you can save some space by cutting them up. And a good way of doing that is putting them on a tray, cut them up, stick them in the freezer so you have these different chunks of pepper, and put them into a bag that you can use and dispense the amount of pepper you want for your flavoring as you cook and use them.
But you say you want to freeze them independently, if you will, for a time, instead of tossing them into a freezer bag upon cutting them, for you'll end up with a lump of peppers?
Yeah, that's right. You'll probably get a lot of ice crystals around there and be a little harder to chisel out to portion out the size you want for your recipe, whatever you're going to use it for flavoring.
And an important caution, if you're cutting up jalapenos, other hot peppers, you might want to don some protective clothing, if you will.
Speaking from experience, that is a good idea to wear some gloves if you're dealing with really hot peppers so that you don't get that chemical on your skin and it'll cause some throbbing for a period of time. So, it's always good working with hot peppers that you wear the protective materials to do that.
And if you're sensitive, you may shed a tear or two while you're cutting those up. But that's part of the game with peppers anyway.
Yeah, don't go from experience. Go ahead and wearing gloves is probably a good idea.
Very good. And once you're done with your pepper and tomato harvest, you can start thinking about cleaning up that site, Greg. They're very important for next year's productivity.
Yeah. Once the peppers are frozen off, you might as well start to get your garden ready for next year. You can leave your cages out in the conditions so that they will go ahead and clean up, so to speak, during the freeze-thaw cycles, and chop up your materials and work that into the soil. Some people like to compost it, but typically that organic tissues can just be incorporated back into the soil.
But once again, do take those steps for you want to start fresh next year with a clean planting site. Anyway, that's how to go about bringing in those final tomatoes and garden peppers for the season. You can find out more information if you're so inclined through your local extension office or online at the K-State Horticulture website. And as far as rounding out your vegetable gardening for another season, Greg, we appreciate you coming by.
I appreciate it. I hope to see some of your salsa and try that this wintertime.
Well, that is an option that you will be afforded. Many thanks to you. Gregg Eyestone with us. He's the Riley County Extension Horticultural Agent, and that is this week's Horticulture segment. So goes today's edition. Once more, we invite you to take advantage of our podcast service if you've not done so already. You can pull up our daily broadcast for listening at your convenience anytime at this website, agtoday.net. That's agtoday.net. In the meantime, please rejoin us right here tomorrow, this same time. Until then, Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.